Welcome classic rock fans to another one of my Patreon videos, and today we're looking at the illicit and shady dealings of bootleg albums. Those wonderful products that used to be served up to us in brown paper bags at record fairs. I used to love them, to be honest with you. I personally think that the bootleg album now is a valuable historical document. Modern art and culture has always been imbued with the illicit product, trying to cash in on the success of something. You know, and go back to Shakespeare's plays are all printed in sort of cheap editions and circulated around, of course. But also more modern, of course, a more modern example would be Charles Dickens, whose works were widely bootlegged in the USA, something that was a constant source of ire for him. In fact, he used to do tours. He used to go over to the USA to try and plead for a better deal for writers, better deal, so they actually got some sort of payment for the cheap editions that were being produced illicitly. Interesting description he did when he was over there. He described his distaste for the American habit of spitting at the time. He describes looking out a train window like somebody plucking a chicken, which was quite an interesting description. I've got a very interesting story for you in terms of the illicit circulation or reproduction of music. In 1770, the Vatican had decreed there was this beautiful piece of music that they decreed that was so beautiful that it must never ever be heard outside of the confines of the Vatican walls. The piece of music in question, of course, was Gregorio Aligheri's Miseria. Forgive me for my crap Italian pronunciation. I hope I've said it correctly. Now, as I said, the Vatican prohibited the performance of this music outside these specific confines. But there was a student in there, a boy, who went to see a performance of this, and this boy was named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart when he was about 14. Now, Mozart was so extraordinary that he later on wrote it down note for note. He memorized it from that very first initial listen, which he would subsequently perform, I believe. So we get the first bootlegged performance. In terms of the etymology of the term bootleg, it actually originates from the American Prohibition era, where there was a habit of smuggling alcohol in sort of tall boots, shoving them down the side. Of course, later it became a term that was widely used for anything that was outlawed and prohibited. But in terms of popular music, of course, which is really what we're talking about here, the bootleg album really sort of took off when there was a massive desire and hunger to fill spaces left by popular artists, namely Bob Dylan, for example. After his motorcycle crash, there was this period of silence where there was nothing from him for a while. Until, of course, little did we know, he decamped to New York with the band and was sort of mining the sort of rootsy authenticity of Americana, which ultimately led to the Basement tapes. Of course, the bootleg we're talking about is a very famous Great White Wonder, which was, I think, little outtakes and snippets from these sort of recording sessions, of course, before they'd be released in part officially sort of in the very early 70s. Another famous bootleg at the time was the Rolling Stones' Liver Than You'll Ever Be. This was a fantastic recording considering the equipment. It was made by a guy who was known as Dub, I think. And of course the Stones issue Get Your Ya-Ya's out as a way of kind of quelling the popularity of this recording. Of course, this sparks lots of bands wanting to release live albums to kind of quell the support or quell the market for their bootlegged product. Of course, you get Deep Purple's Made in Japan, and of course, more famously, The Who Live at Leeds, which was actually kind of a bootleg parody in many respects. It was manufactured and made to look like a bootleg album, but it was anything but. Of course, by doing that, of course, bands manage to seize artistic control over what gets released in their name, and they get to make a bit of money on it, of course. But there was nothing so raw, illicit and dirty as the genuine audience recording. Apart from the Grateful Dead. My hat's off to the Grateful Dead, of course, who would encourage their audience to record their performances. In fact, they even allowed their audience to plug whatever device they had into the mixing desk so they could get a better quality recording. The proviso, of course, the caveat was that these recordings must not be sold, they must just be passed around to other deadheads. Which is why we have an unlimited ocean of Grateful Dead live recordings, of course. I imagine somebody's making money off them now, though. Interesting aside, of course, Dub, the guy that records the Rolling Stones Live Than You'll Ever Be, went on to form the trademark of quality bootleg record label. I don't know if you remember those. I used to go to record fairs quite a lot. I used to collect Pink Floyd vinyl bootlegs. I used to have quite a collection, to be honest with you. I've sold them all recently. Interestingly, these bootlegs often come as limited, very limited edition, only so many copies. How reliable that actually was, we don't know. Seeing it was an illicit product, we can't really take that as being pucker, so to speak. But you know, I had lots of Floyd bootlegs. Do you remember the Swinging Pig label? Now, for me, the Swinging Pig label was kind of like the trademark of quality bootleg. It was a much better quality product. Even audience recordings. I had a couple of audience recordings from the Animals tour. One of the famous ones I had was the Pink Floyd BBC Psychedelic years. And they used to get lots of radio performances that would be harvested by bootleggers, pressed and released. Now, subsequently, of course, all these radio recordings and John Peel sessions and things have all been released officially, not just Pink Floyd, but lots of other bands as well. Of course, it was live audience recordings that were specifically very interesting, I think, in many respects. Interestingly, NME did do their own poll of what were the most important bootleg albums of all time. Of course, they list the Dylan one and the Stones one, as I've just mentioned. But the top of their list is the Smiths' Devil's Charm, one of the many Smiths bootlegs, but this one was actually cribbed from recordings of shows at the Derby Assembly Rooms and London Electric Ballroom in 1983. Of course, Prince's Black Album was an incredibly important bootleg as well. Of course, what is the future of these bootleg recordings? Because everybody takes a recording device into concerts now. They've all got their phones. You could probably piece together a concert you've been to by people who just prefer you to watch the concert through the high-def screen of their iPhone. Personally, I think these audience recordings are historical documents, valuable historical documents. I mean, the Doors on their Bright Midnight series have released a lot of their audience recordings, if not all of them. I suppose there are a few that are just so bad they're just unlistenable. That being said, I don't know what technology exists. I love the idea of there being the technology to take these recordings, separate the separate elements, remaster them and put them back together, but I don't know if it does. Unfortunately, of course, all these would have been recorded onto one channel. You got drums, vocals, audience, everything onto one channel, and you'd have to, so you get bleeding through on everything. It's one sort of sonic splodge. For what I'm suggesting, they would have to be able to isolate all the different elements, take them apart, remaster, clean them up, and then put them back together again. Perhaps lower the audience noise down a bit. I don't know if that's possible. I don't suppose it is. I figured if it was possible, they would be doing it. That being said, I think it won't be long before, in a few years, we'll start seeing audience bootlegs getting official releases, because people want to hear them, people want them. I mean, there's nothing official of the Pink Floyd Animals tour, for example. There's quite a few audience bootlegs out there. But I would love to see an official campaign of the bands taking control of these recordings and trying to release the very best version they can. There's some wonderful Jethro Tull bootlegs from the early 70s of the Thick of Brick tour and Passion Play tour. You know, it'd be so interesting to see what could be done with those recordings. Probably not much, I don't know. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the illicit bootleg albums. Share your thoughts below, please. Click like, subscribe, check out the Facebook page. I don't know why I'm saying this. Anyway, thank you for watching.